Seattle is like named one of the most expensive places to live in now, and I can see it. I mean, everything is becoming expensive. It makes people feel like Seattle doesn't love people who love Seattle. When I first moved here, I had a 2-bedroom apartment for $650. For $700,000, you can get a 1-bedroom shack that needs a whole new kitchen and floors and so much work that has to be put into it. There are so many single parents like myself who that's just not something that's in their future.
Thank you. You did a wonderful job.
I tried getting pre-approval with just my income by myself. They're like, no, you can afford a house at $200,000, which of course is not going to get you anything, especially for the size of my family, because I have, the 5 kids. And even though we made it work in a 2-bedroom, it's just not enough space. I had to just find what was affordable, and what was affordable was in the deepness of Maple Valley. So my kids went to school here in Seattle, which took them about 2.5 hours to get to school every day. So we made sacrifices to try and make it work.
Yes. Here you go, Mom. Your daughter. You want to help me? We're going to cook you dinner?
I came across Habitat for Humanity, and I came across Homestead Community Land Trust, and I got excited because they had these programs that were geared towards affordable housing and people who had jobs like mine, and police officers, social workers, bus drivers, whatever, that didn't meet like that tech criteria of making 6 figures. And so I got really excited, and then we were able to close on this 5-bedroom house. So go from a 2-bedroom to a 5-bedroom that's way closer to my job. The feeling of just signing those papers and getting those keys was like, I felt like I just gave my kids something that people want to be able to give but don't think it's possible. I gave them something that's actually going to benefit their life and change their life. It's giving them generational wealth. It has just given us a sense of security, like, we have this. This is ours. No one can take it from us. We have a place that we can now call home.
I tell people, you choose to live in Kittitas County. There isn't a job or a school that's really bringing you to this area. It's really your own personal desire. We're a small little resort community about an hour east of Seattle. The personality and landscape is kind of that small town lifestyle with tons of outdoor recreation. If you want to relocate here and move here, you definitely need to love the outdoors. If you don't like rattlesnakes, do not purchase over here. If you buy a cabin in these locations, in the winter months, you will be snowmobiling in. I've been selling real estate here in Kittitas County for almost 20 years, and I sell single-wide, $1 million homes and all the dirt in between. Even when I first started 20 years ago, the I-90 commuters have chosen to live here more because it's affordable. So now things have shifted a little bit because guess what? We're not as cheap and affordable as we used to be. In fact, there's some statistics out there that show that Kittitas County is at a higher median price than some areas of King County. Oh, and by the way, gas is cheapest in the entire state in Cle Elum. So gas up before you leave. These homes were completed in 2019 and they started at $319 a piece. Now they're right about $600. We have Suncadia, which is a destination resort. Most of the homes in Suncadia are over $1 million. So we've seen almost a 51% price over price increase from 2020 to 2021. I don't expect 51% appreciation year over year in the next coming years. I do, however, still expect us to appreciate. We're seeing definitely a shift in the personalities of the people who buy in Upper County. And without getting into politics, a lot of people are exiting Seattle for political reasons. But because we've had so much fluctuation of what I call the moderate Democrat coming out of Seattle, we really kind of have become purple right here, where we used to be pretty red. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It brings in different ideas. It brings in revitalization. Change is a good thing. Affordability is crucial in every market because although we are a luxury product market, meaning most of our clients that come in here have the ability to be able to afford the pricing here, they still need services. We don't have apartments. We don't have duplexes. I think the affordability piece is really working with our local officials to create affordable housing. And that means rezoning some things, upzoning some things, and really work with them to still keep us a destination, but we don't want to become a Seattle. So we don't want unheard of traffic. We want people to be able to come over here, recreate, and still keep our small town vibe.
Seattle's housing market is kind of a mess. $250,000 will get you a 400 square foot condo. Try to buy a house for less than $600,000 in most of Seattle, and you'll find nothing. The median Seattle home is selling for $855,000. When you look at just single-family homes, it jumps over $950,000. Part of the problem is there's not much supply and a ton of demand. Seattle has consistently topped lists of the fastest-growing cities in the U.S. The population has increased by about 150,000 in the past decade, with many coming for high-paying tech jobs. Housing construction hasn't kept pace, and 80% of it has been apartments built for renters. So, do you have to be rich to be a homeowner here? Even 8 months ago, the answer was almost definitively yes. Buyers needed a lot of money to compete in a world where all-cash offers for 20% over asking price were common. But the market has cooled a little in 2022, thanks in part to rising interest rates. Higher interest rates mean higher monthly mortgage payments, but also slightly less competition, giving buyers more negotiating power. It also opens the door to alternative financing like 2-to-1 mortgage buydowns, which lower the interest rate for the first 2 years of the loan. Similarly, adjustable rate mortgages lower the rate for 5, 7, or 10 years before reverting to market rate. The trade-off with adjustable rates is that buyers could end up paying more in the long term than with a fixed mortgage. For a lucky few lower-income residents, there are nonprofit programs that can drastically reduce the cost of buying a home. But the housing market cooldown hasn't made Seattle cheap. Right now, to buy a $650,000 townhome with 3% down, a buyer would pay $4,500 a month and needs a household income of at least $160,000 to comfortably afford that. That might not be rich by Seattle standards, but for more than half the city's residents, that's still far out of reach. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Josh Cohen, city reporter for Crosscut.com, the newsroom at KCTS9 Seattle. Today, we're going to focus on homelessness, an issue that's been a vexing problem for many of us in Seattle and cities around the country. I will be speaking with Mark Dones. They're the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. King County encompasses Seattle. The Regional Homelessness Authority was established in 2019 to coordinate the city and county's homeless response, provide strategic planning and oversight, and provide direct outreach to people on the street, among other functions. Mark's past work has included research on racial inequities among those experiencing homelessness, including how network impoverishment leaves communities of color more vulnerable to becoming homeless. Hi, Mark, and welcome.
Hey, Josh, it's good to see you again.
You as well. Mark, let's start with our current situation in King County. 40,000 people are homeless, possibly more. How have we ended up in this crisis, and why did things get worse during the pandemic?
Well, I think the benefit of having worked nationally before we launched the authority is that I do have a fair amount of experience with sort of the national landscape that leads to homelessness. And, I can pretty safely say that for every single community, the answer is that we have a housing crisis. And we've had a housing crisis for quite some time. And so anything that any community asks about why so many folks are experiencing homelessness, why are, folks disproportionately impacted if they're from communities of color, all of that is the result of really poor housing policy, coming off of, really aggressive redlining and other racialized ways of interacting with the housing market prior to that. And so that's just the not to be funny, the foundation that we are working with. And the bottom line is that we will not get to a sustainable end to homelessness until we fundamentally address, and I would argue transform, how we approach housing development and sort of resourcing communities to take care of their own.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, and this seems like sort of a simple question, but why is it that a lack of affordable housing leads to homelessness? I don't think everybody necessarily draws that straight line.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but to me, a person who's perhaps doing this for too long, it is funny. I mean, like the bottom line is that like the condition of experiencing homelessness is you don't have a home, and the solution to that is having a home. And the reason why people come to experience homelessness is relatively straightforward. It is the economics of being inside in this country. We know anyone, I'm sure, the folks that are listening, whether they are homeowners or renters, they're probably paying too much for their housing. We know that, rental payments, while the comfortable margin that you're supposed to spend on your rent is roughly a third of your income. We know that the vast majority of people are spending, probably half of their monthly income, if not more, on rent. We know that certainly, as we've seen some of the interest rates rise, et cetera, right? Like the same is true for, recent homeowners or folks who are not refinanced and locked into some of those earlier low interest rates. And all of that, the economics of renting or buying a home in this country, those are the things that drive people to experience homelessness. And I will take the liberty of also saying, that there's always this narrative that homelessness is driven by behavioral health issues or substance use issues. And, I think that it's really critical that folks understand that for the vast majority of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness and have that, issue with either substance use or behavioral health, the onset of those conditions is often after they become homeless, right? Like that it is homelessness as a condition that drives, right, those other ancillary conditions. And similarly, right, like many people have substance use issues or have, other broader behavioral health issues and are inside. And so it is unfortunately, simple, right? Like I think that we want homelessness to be much more complex than it is. And the reality is that we have a poor housing market, we have low production, we have hamstrung production. And so the result is people don't have homes.
And is there anything about our large and lasting homelessness crisis in the Seattle region that's different from the homelessness crises in other American cities?
To be candid, I think the one difference is that we have a pretty good shot at solving it. I think that, again, like how everyone wound up here is the same. And so now the only question that any community contends with is what resources can they bring to bear to fixing it? And, Seattle and King County are frankly fortunate in potentially having the resources that could be brought to bear to, at the very least end our unsheltered crisis. And with, expanded state and federal support, end homelessness broadly.
Yeah, that leads me right to my next question, which is hoping you can explain to folks sort of what the King County Regional Homelessness Authority is and does, and how that has been a shift in how our region is trying to address homelessness?
In terms of what we, oversee, it is we are the county's sort of emergency room when it comes to homelessness. And I liken us to an emergency room because we don't do prevention and we don't do long-term, inclusionary neighborhood work, right? I think it's important, obviously, clearly based on what I just said. I'm a believer that we need those mixed income inclusive neighborhoods in order for long-term solutions, but that's not what we're here to do. We're here to ensure that no one has to sleep outside in the county. And so in that way, we are the ER with regard to homelessness. If I can see you, then the worst thing has already happened, right? You've cut off the thumb, you've had the heart attack, right? Like that, you've had the thing that brought you to the ER. And now my job is to stabilize you as rapidly as possible and get you transitioned into that long-term care, which for us means rehouse you and connect you with the resources and services and supports that are going to keep you housed.
And what are the pieces of that sort of emergency room triage system? Like, I think people would be curious to hear just sort of like, they know that there are outreach workers out there. They have some sense of shelter. What are sort of all the pieces that get somebody from the street to the emergency room and then looking beyond towards permanent housing?
So the things that we have direct oversight of are, the outreach continuum, shelter, emergency housing, transitional housing, and we have some role in permanent supportive housing, both through our coordinated entry system, and we also fund a number of the services contracts that are attached to those developments. I think that what we have demonstrated through some of our work, we also manage the emergency housing voucher program to some degree with our partners at the housing authorities. But I think what we've demonstrated through some of our work, what this agency is committed to, again, is the rapid rehousing of people. And so we're trying as much as possible to shorten that timeline, between, I think to your point, when we identify that someone needs help outside and when they are inside, right? And doing as much as possible across certainly our new programs to, chart the course for how quickly we can bring someone inside. And as we move into next year, where we are going to reconfigure the entire system, much of the system will start to look like the things that we've done in 2022 that are having that rapid turnaround time, right? Weeks, not months.
I'm curious if there are communities around the country, any cities that have any sort of best practices in addressing homelessness, in addressing their affordable housing crisis that we have not adopted in the Seattle region that maybe you have an eye towards for future adoption.
I'm looking really hard at Houston. They've had a significant amount of success in their sort of streets to home model. And so the authority has adopted inside our what's called our right of way work. It's what is really at the heart of our Partnership for Zero work, which is rather than asking people, do they want to move into a congregate shelter, we're asking people, do you want to move into housing, right? And what we are using in some of our more successful deployments here in King County is a combination of emergency housing and permanent housing, but housing on both ends of the spectrum. And that is really modeled off the success that we've seen in Houston, where they have really been able to house, I think it's around 25,000 people just by going into encampments over the last, I want to say 5-6 years, and offering people housing, right? Not really, for lack of a better term, sort of futzing around with other intervention types that are more temporary or offer people less dignity, less safety, less support. So that's something that I'm very interested in bringing to King County. Another thing that I am looking at from another community is San Diego, who have demonstrated in their emergency housing voucher work a really nimble and impressive reduction in bureaucracy. So they are really working to ensure that people are not having to interact with six different agencies to get inside. They're interacting with two, right? And that I think is really important. I think where we have had solid success is where we have prioritized having stable relationships with folks rather than cycling them through 6 or 10 or 15 different case managers and organizations. And I think San Diego has, I want to say like a 95 or 100% lease up rate as a result of their ability to, again, really reduce the amount of bureaucracy that people are having to move through. So I think those are two communities that I'm quite impressed with their work, and am interested in seeing if we can duplicate some of those strategies here.
What mistakes do you see cities and communities make when trying to address homelessness?
I think the most common mistake is failing to integrate people with lived expertise into the solving of the problem, right? I am, I don't know, I'm proud to say, but it is certainly a fact that, I couch surf for 2 years. I have a significant mental health issue, which caused me to be hospitalized twice in my teens. And about 70% of my staff has lived expertise, right? Either directly with homelessness or with, again, the associated systems like the criminal legal system or the behavioral health system. And what I often see in communities that are really failing to get their programs off the ground, inclusive of these new emergency housing vouchers, is those of us who are closest to the problem, who've been there, who've really had to figure it out, are not at the table in real decision-making ways, right? Instead, we are on these tokenized advisory bodies where, we are churning out recommendation reports that get shelved and never listened to, never implemented. And oftentimes, right, like they're shelved because the recommendations in those reports would be hard to do, right? They would cause a really significant shift in practice or behavior, or who has power, or why a program is working the way that it does. And I think it's very clear, from the fact that we have a 90% lease up rate in our emergency housing voucher program, right? Like and we're one of the largest COCs in the country. We have through our right of way work, again, we've resolved 4 long-standing encampments that people told me to my face would be there forever. And the reason we have been able to make those advancements is because we listened very closely to the people who were living outside and then built the intervention tailor to what they said, right? We didn't say, well, we like that part, but we're actually gonna, we're still gonna check. We just did exactly what people said they needed, and the results, I think, speak for themselves. And so, if there's one thing that I could really push every community in the country to do, it is, dissolve your advisory committees and integrate people with lived expertise into the real decisional process. Give people that veto power. Give people the power to design the programs that they're going to use, and I promise you'll see a different result.
As a closing question, I think we often talk about solving homelessness and ending homelessness. I want to know if you think that is an achievable goal, and if so, what are the pieces that get us there?
I mean, I think very straightforwardly, ending homelessness is a real thing. I think, I have a dream that in King County, there is a future that shouldn't be far away, where if someone is losing their housing, right, they're able to pick up the phone, call 211, and someone is able to route them, perhaps even, send a van to pick them up with their belongings and move them into emergency housing that same day. No one should have to sleep outside. it's simply not required in a society that is as advanced as ours, right? That's a choice that we're making, and I think we can choose differently. And when I look at the polling, I'm clear that the voters want us to choose differently. Beyond that, right, the sort of broader notion of ending homelessness, where no one is even making that call, I also think that's possible. And I think that, there are ways that we could deploy our resources, again, as a community, as a society, more efficaciously to keep people in housing, as opposed to having to wait for them to descend into the worst possible crisis before we deploy an intervention, right? So that's really moving upstream and thinking about, sort of rent assistance, rent stabilization, more flexible use of diversion funds, the things that are really going to make sure that, again, I never see you in the ER. And it's the same kind of approach that we have taken towards, heart disease and other sort of chronic ailments that, it's that public health approach of, if we drive down the number of people who need the intervention, then we can start to right size the healthcare system, the ERs, et cetera, et cetera. I think, we have the same vision here at the Authority for the Homelessness System, that it shouldn't be as big as it is, right? We shouldn't need as much money as we do. And the way to make sure that we are able to right size the system is to really support our partners who are managing those prevention initiatives and scaling their work and getting it to be as robust as is necessary. And the last thing that I'll say on this, which, I think is slightly less technical, is, my experience working in this space is that there's a profound sense of fatalism around homelessness and poverty in America. This belief that, there's no way to get out of these problems in a permanent and durable way. And I think that, again, when I think about the electorate, what I see in the polling, what I, hear people say to me when I'm out in community, is that sense of fatalism is not shared by the voters. It's not shared by the people who are entrusting us with public resources. In fact, quite the opposite. What they're saying is, you need to get this done, right? And they have an expectation that rather than lifting our hands and saying, woe is me, this is, too complex, too hard, not doable, that we will deploy our best thinking, our most innovative strategies. We will learn from other systems that have been successful at getting their tasks done and get it done here. And so, regardless of whether or not I personally believe that it is endable or not, and again, I do, I am a public official. I have the unique privilege of serving as an appointed official for one of the largest counties in the country, working for a community that I love. And they have asked me to get a job done on their behalf, and that is what I will do.
Great. Well, there's probably no better place to end a conversation about homelessness than a hopeful note. So, Mark, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks, Josh. A pleasure to be with you as always.
All right.